Simon, it's an honor to have you here. You have your place there. Thank you so much.
Great, Enrique. First of all, I'd like to thank Enrique and Magda and Hans and you and everybody at the Congress for inviting me along. Thank you. And I'd also like to thank Hans for his really fascinating talk. Mine probably shan't be quite as fantastic as that, but it certainly is in the same vein of the things that kind of seem quite obvious on the surface are actually a lot more complicated when you start to look. Yeah, before I start, I should say that I haven't done one of these for a long time, so I should say sorry in advance in case it's a bit creaky around the sides, as is also the PowerPoint that I will get Enrique to start in a moment as well, and also, as you can probably tell, I do stammer, so I've kind of worked my talk to hopefully fit the time right well, but depending how it goes, we might finish really fast, or we might need to cut bits out, but we shall see. So Enrique, would you mind putting on the first slide for me, please? Lovely. That's it. Do it.
Can everyone see the presentation?
That's fine.
We can see the presentation, but it would be good if you made it full screen because we have all sorts of stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, that's.
How about now?
Okay, we can see several things at the same time. So slide 1 and then slide 2. So we have the view into what's happening next.
Let me change. Wow. Let me change the view of the presentation. Sorry, Magda, can you fill the blanks, please?
So you need to stop sharing in that case.
Okay.
I'm not sure if I'm going to be any better, but sure, I'll try. I'll mute myself.
Fabulous. Well done. Lovely. Thank you. Okay. This talk came out of writing the introductions for 2 recent books that I have worked on. Actually, Enrique mentioned them, and as with all books, although you've kind of written them, they actually won't be out in the world for some time yet. But it's for the intros for 1000 Vampires on Screen and the Palgrave Handbook. And the interesting thing that was that with both of those books, it really kind of gets you to think about the genre as a whole, because we always tend to dig into our own small parts, but when you actually see it as a whole, you kind of get a much more kind of overview feel. So and within that, you find that there's also these various threads, and we all have our own thread. But when you kind of pull back, you can kind of see how all these come along and where they start from and how they rise and fall. But with that, it kind of quite interesting how the 1970s seemed a very important part or very important point of the ongoing story of the genre as a whole. But when we think of the 1970s, we tend to think of, and if Magda, you could do the next slide for me. Here we go. So you tend to think of the 1970s, and there's always a few films you think, oh yeah, that's it. So you've got the Nosferatu remake, Vampire Lovers, Salem's Lot, Count Yorga, George Hamilton, Love at First Bite, the Frank Langella, and Udo Kier, and Count Dracula, of course. However, what actually happened in the 1970s was the next slide, Magda, if you wouldn't mind. This one. So because there's just so many films, I couldn't put them all up, but I put it down by year, as you can see on the left-hand side, of how many films each year. Now, with that, that really is only the kind of main ones. Those numbers really are can really change depending on how low budget or how bad a quality of the films or TV films or series you want to go. And it also really depends on how much you want the vampire to be included in it, whether they're the main thing or whether they're a side thing or whether they just have a very brief mention. So you can see on the other side, I picked out 1974 just because it wasn't the largest by far, but the kind of text is kind of large enough so you can still see what things were out that year. So as I say, the 70s seemed a real turning point in that. And it became a real kind of tipping point of the vampire in the popular imagination. So even though with the 1960s there was still a lot of stuff around, but by the 1970s suddenly they just seem to be everywhere. So yes, so what also comes out of looking at all these films in the 70s is that one, there is way more stuff there than you would first think, and also there was no real overarching theme. With that, there was actually quite a few different things. So this then brings me to for that second point, to say that in relation to things such as Nina Auerbach's oft quoted comment, which is summarized in the blurb for her book, every age embraces the vampire it needs and gets the vampire it deserves, which is a great quote and has been variously used and abused over the years, not least by scholars such as ourselves, wanting to promote the aptness and importance of whatever variety of vampire they are currently talking or writing about. But a quick look at these films, as seen in the list for the 1970s, it quickly shows that the idea of every age might be a bit more involved than one might have thought, and that any age or generation is made up of various groups of very different people. And of note here, and worth keeping in mind as we go forward, is how self-referential the vampire genre is. And as Judith Jack Halberstam describes, Gothic monsters such as the vampire carry the scars or undead memory of their creation with them. So all these vampires themselves are born from other vampires. So it's important to remember that the vampire we deserve is not only one of many in any particular age, but carries with it the scars of vampires that came before it. But to highlight how this plays out, it's worth pulling out a few important threads that began or attained more solidity in the 1970s, and where they came from and their ongoing importance. There are many to choose from. Even from a quick look through like the list of films there are sort of threads such as the sympathetic vampire, vampire comedies, black vampires, real vampires, political vampires, female vampires, detective vampires, kung fu vampires, the vampire apocalypse, feral vampires, vampiric buildings, vampire conspiracies, vampire cults, and even human farming, amongst many others. But for this talk, I shall just pull out four, which will be the sympathetic vampire, black vampires, female vampires, and detective vampires. So Magda, could you move on to the next slide, please? Lovely. So, sympathetic vampires. When you mention sympathetic vampires, most vampire fans would point to Anne Rice. And in interview with the vampire has been something of an origin point for it, with Lestat or Louis, depending on your choice. In particular, being a vampire character we get to love, hate, admire, and fear. Yet there were as rounded or tragic vampires before that, which we could also sympathise with, going back to characters such as Varney the vampire, for instance, or Harriet Brand from Blood of the Vampire, came out the same year as Bram Stoker's Dracula, who both anguish over their vampiric existence and commit suicide rather than continue living as a vampire. Probably more relevant to us here today are characters such as Barnabas Collins, who we can see on the far left, from Dark Shadows, Prince Mamualdi, from Dracula, James Eastman from Grave of the Vampire on the top right, or even Martin, of course, not necessarily a sympathetic vampire, but maybe a very confused human, who knows, or even Diane Fanu from the Velvet Vampire. Each has gone through a myriad of emotions in coming to terms with, or not, their undead existence. James Eastman, played by William Smith on top right, is interesting also because he is a damnfear who tracks down the vampire that created him and killed his mother, only to succumb to the curse himself. This is not unlike Dracula, who finds himself enacting the same kind of violence as the white vampire that made him. And with Diane Le Fanu is similar to the Countess from Kumail's daughters of Darkness, who is also a very sympathetic vampire, not just because they are both amazingly fabulous, but they have a view of a certain kinds of males that makes it easy for us to sympathize with them now. However, Barnabas is probably the most important one for us here. So he first appeared in the soap opera Dark Shadows in 1967 and continued to its end in 1971. He's important for two reasons. First, his appearance and subsequent success on a daytime TV series marked a shift where vampires were not just for Hammer films, but could appear in popular TV series too. Something we'll look at more closely in Vampire Detectives. Second, he had a long and varied storyline involving a long-lost love, revenge, witchcraft, family ties, and even becoming human again, kind of. In fact, all these facets make him a vampire that not only spoke for himself, always important when thinking about sympathetic vampires, but in true soap opera tradition, he mirrored our own lives, though dialed up rather more. I would argue that more so for an American audience. It's quite interesting how Dark Shadows never seems to be quite so well known over or outside of the States. The stat would not have happened without Barnabas. And indeed, later and more problematic sympathetic vampires like Ramirez Martin, Frank Langella's Count Dracula, and even Gary Oldman's equally dialed up version of Vlad. Okay, so then moving on, just so I do manage to squeeze it all in. Next slide, please, Magda. We have black vampires, and we have top left from the Satanic Rites of Dracula, Blackler below, and Gandra from Gandra and Hess, Nocturna from Nocturna, and then we have Omega Man and Old Dracula. So the 70s being the the 70s, there were some rather of their times or outright racist representations of Black America and Black vampires in films of that decade. Often in vampire comedies, as seen in old Dracula, as you can see in the one on the right with David Niven, who, like some British actors of a certain age, were in some truly awful films. So here, Count Dracula revitalizes his wife Vampira via blood transfusion, which turns her black. Fortunately, the film tends to be forgotten because it's just dreadful. Also, and Love at First Bite, where the heavily tanned Count makes fun of New York's black community through racist jokes. However, when you mention Black vampires in relation to the 70s, of course, most people would initially go to Dracula from 1972 as possibly the first instance of that, but Black vampires had actually been around since John Polidori published his seminal vampire text. The Black Vampire, a legend of Saint Domingo from 1819, published under the pseudonym of Uriah Derrick Darcy, is actually a slave narrative where a slave is killed, resurrected as a vampire, and then seeks revenge on the captor that killed him. Being set before the Haitian slave revolution, it also points to interesting connections between vampires and zombies, as zombies kind of took over that field. The previously mentioned Harriet Brandt from Blood of the Vampire had tainted blood due to her father's dealings in the Caribbean, and this idea of slavery and violence is something that is also at the heart of Dracula. However, we shouldn't forget Omega Man from 1971, because that also featured what should have been quite a few Black vampires. Though due to the curious nature of the film, they were actually turned white. The film, unlike Matheson's novel, from which it came from, only features humans and vampires. There is no third thing. And within the film, they actually represent different forms of white culture, offering with one offering equality, but one where everyone is the same without a past or a future. And I think past and future is always very important within films around that era, particularly involving Black vampires. This picks up a point that is central to Dracula. Scream Dracula Scream from 73, Ganja and Hess from 1973, which are all centered around the relation of 1970s Black American identity with its past. And what all of them seem to suggest is that the traumas of that past and their reenactment in the present can only damage contemporary Black American identity and the wider Black community. So in Dracula, he reenacts the white violence that made him on those nearest to him, i.e. the Black community that he then lives in. And Hess, from Ganja and Hess, he never preys on the wealthy white community that lives around him, but actually travels back to the Black neighborhood in New York to find his food. Of importance in relation to Ganja and to a lesser extent Dracula is how the female Black vampire is far more pragmatic about her predicament. And Hell becomes much more of a figure of making the best of what she has, often embracing city life and modern America. This is something which is also seen in the other non-white female vampires of that era and beyond, such as Nocturna, is the one in the middle, granddaughter of Dracula, that starred Nye Bonet as the eponymous vampire. Her status as a person of color who refuses to be controlled by the past and embraces American city life as embodied by disco in the film, positions her as a forerunner of other non-white women that rule over the city space, as seen in later films such as Vampire's Kiss from 1988 and Death by Temptation in 1990. Which rather neatly leads us on to the next thread. And Magda, if you wouldn't mind moving on to the next slide, which is female vampires. So here you might be able to tell we have the top left, Rabid, and then Fascination, and then Vampirus Lesbos, and down Nocturna again, and then Twins of Evil, and of course the fabulous Daughters of Darkness. The early years of the 1970s were particularly good for strong female vampires. Many, as you'd expect, veer towards the exploitational, though often not without style. Interesting genre points and imagination. Hammer released its Karnstein trilogy of vampire lovers, Love for a Vampire and Twins of Evil, that increasingly spiral away from their from Le Fanu's Carmilla, and they also produced their own take on the on the Bathory legend in Countess Dracula. These and Hammer in general, in turn inspired European and American filmmakers and a plethora of films appeared around the same time that either continued the Carmilla theme, such as the blood spattered bride, Let's Scare Jessica to Death, or opted for the Bathory-esque Queen of the Vampires trope, as seen in Daughters of Darkness, The Velvet Vampire, The Werewolf versus the Vampire Woman, The Devil's Wedding Night, and The Vampire Night Orgy, all from the early 1970s. Alongside this, Jean Rollin and Jess Franco produced some of their most interesting vampire films, with Vampire Lesbos, Franco, and Fascination, Rollins, mentioned before. Female vampires also featured in the European folklore-inspired Teritza and the coming-of-age tales Valerie and Her Week of Wonders, and Lemora, a child's tale of the supernatural. Unsurprisingly, most of these female vampires that usurped the male order had to die, though curiously, many managed to survive in one form or another. Countess Bathory from Daughters of Darkness transfers her essence into the body of another, which was also seen in also earlier seen in Blood and Roses, but also in Vampire Ecstasy from 1973, possibly Vampire Lesbos, we're not sure, and in the latter Nadia from 1994. Also, we have an example of the life going on that Anna, Queen of the Vampires, and indeed in Cronenberg's Babbitt, the female vampires die, but not before passing their gift on, so that lives on beyond them. And also, interestingly, Fascination also pictures a society of female vampires that will continue on long after the film ends, which is also seen in the later film The Last Sect from 2006. Excuse me, check this page. And also Gandra and Hess, Nocturna, and the Vampire Happening, a very strange film, all see the female vampire walking off into the future, or becoming part of the whirl and rush of the city. So it's nice to see that unlike the male ones, they don't need to die, they can actually find a life somewhere else. This brings us on, make sure the time's going okay. This brings us on to the last part for this. Magda, if you wouldn't mind putting on the last slide, or the next slide. Wonderful. Which is Vampire Detectives. As you can see here, we have John Saxon as Vampire, which I think was, I want to say, Starsky and Hutch. And below that, we have Lorne Green from Hardy Boys, and then John Carradine, which is the one from McLeod, I think. And then we have Blade, of course, and Captain Kronos, and name quickly goes from my head, but from I shall have this here in a minute. Kolchak, of course. Anyway, so even in folklore, vampires were always linked to the idea of detection, usually through discovering the identity of the vampire themselves or the graves from which they were buried. This features in Stoker's Dracula, of course, with Van Helsing taking on the role of the lead investigator. And of course, Sherlock Holmes himself also investigated a vampire, only to prove that it, in fact, wasn't one. Unsurprisingly, this has continued into movies where Van Helsing, occasionally hapless Cockney policeman, or plucky American reporters, had to uncover the true identity of the most suspicious character in the room. We shouldn't forget, of course, that the vampiric nature of Carmilla Milaka was also equally difficult to detect. The 1970s, though, brought that aspect of the vampire narrative more explicitly to the fore. And while some use the folkloric idea of a vampire slayer as detective, as seen in Captain Kronos, others sought to update the trope. This led to a very different kind of vampire hunter or investigator, which produced the Night Stalker in 1972, which then produced the Night Strangler as part of the ongoing series that came from that, and also the Norlis tapes in 1973. All of these featured investigative reporters who were involved in cases of mysterious murders where the bodies were drained of blood. The first two of the most interesting here, as both starred Darren Darren McGavin as Carl Kolchak, the rather crumpled but persistent Las Vegas reporter that then moved to Seattle, and that would then go on to star in a TV series, Kolchak the Night Stalker, which relocated him to Chicago. However, it established the idea of a supernatural style series, which, along with shows like the Twilight Zone and Night Gallery, that featured a monster of the week style format, that they would then all necessarily have a vampire episode. The vampire episode in Night Stalker was in the first series. That served the genre up until, of course, the time when Buffy the Vampire Slayer began. As mentioned earlier, this actually follows, as mentioned earlier with the other themes, this already follows a precedent set in earlier Hollywood films of the 1930s and 40s, as seen in The Return of Dr. X in 1939 and the Devil Bat from 1940, where a plucky newspaper reporter finds himself involved with a story so fantastic that no one will believe him, so he has to solve it himself. The importance of shows like Kolchak and Dark Shadows mentioned earlier was that they blurred the boundaries between the supernatural and the everyday, which meant that vampires were not only for films, but for daily television. A point which is further emphasized by popular shows such as the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew Mysteries, Starsky and Hutch and McCloud, and even BJ and the Bear, featuring a vampire episode, all of which usually ended ambiguously as to whether the villain was actually a vampire or not. Of course, none of these examples feature a vampire as the detective, a trope that became more prominent in the late 90s and early 2000s. And so with that, it's worth mentioning the appearance of Blade. You should never forget that Blade started in the 1970s, who first appeared in The Tomb of Dracula in 1973. While not exactly a detective, he is effectively a vampire that hunts other vampires. He is, of course, a Damphia, half vampire, half human, which gives him the qualities of both and an inherent hatred of vampires. And this follows European folklore that often shows a Damphia as becoming vampire hunters. This also sets up a division amongst vampires themselves, where some are good and others bad. Also a very important point for the genre as it moved on. So you have vampires that are more or less human or humane, which is fundamental to later examples of vampire detectives such as Nick Knight, Harry Fitzroy, and Mick St. John. In conclusion, I think I'm still in time. As mentioned previously, just from these four threads, and I've really only lightly touched on all of them, it's easy to see how they are entangled with each other. Blade is a sympathetic vampire. He's black, and he's a vampire hunter detective. He's also preventing the vampire apocalypse. Ganja from Ganja and Hess is also sympathetic, black, female, and a vampire survivor. And Rose from Rabid is sympathetic, a female, and instigator of the vampire apocalypse, and creates feral vampires or zompires, depending on which way you want to go. All of these reflect and are created by their times and have evolved from earlier kinds of vampires and will in turn influence others. More so, they all contain very specific messages about the particular cultural world they emerge from. And consequently are aimed at very specific audiences as well. This audience, of course, is the one that is most receptive to that message, and each vampire will have its own audience. So indeed, each of those different audiences, ages, generations, gets the vampire they deserve. But we should remember that an age or generation is never made up of one audience, but never made up of one audience, but many. Thank you. That's it. Oh, hello.
Enrique, you're muted.
I am sorry, I was muted. Oh, Simon, the 70s was a very special time for vampires over the media. So this was very insightful, and with all your knowledge, I mean, it was a very good conversation. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any question for Simon? Now is the time.
Hi, Simon. It's not really a question, just really a comment, I guess. I really found that it's odd because because you are completely right. The 70s is transformative for vampires, but when I think of vampires, the 70s, and that's not me disagreeing with your thing. It's just me kind of, I think, not properly thinking it out to now. But like, there were so many. I mean, yeah, like you'd interviewed the vampire. The novel was published in the 1970s, and then you had the great everything. So like, and you're right. Oh, there was all the adaptation, the different trilogies, the Dracula, and it's just a lot. So I mean, I don't know. I mean, which do you personally think, based on your research? I guess if I had to form a question out of it, would you say would be the most impactful? I mean, I really think impactful can be kind of, well, it's extremely subjective, but I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think it's really difficult with that, just because that you can always trace it to something before. You know, say like with Anne Rice, everybody will say, "Oh yeah, Anne Rice," and there was a big audience and everything. That is, in terms of. So you can kind of have earlier examples, but the audience, or a wider audience, is not necessarily as receptive to the idea. So in some ways, I always think it's back to that whole thing between why did we end up with VHS tapes rather than Betamax? Because as the experts know, that Betamax was much better and all this sort of thing. But it kind of has to do with something that kind of works right for the crowd. And I think although there has been a lot of earlier instances of sympathetic vampires of various kinds, and say and Barnabas is certainly one. I always think Barnabas and even Dan Curtis and Bob Kelsjan actually were very influential at the time of all the kind of films and series they made around vampires. That with Anne Rice, I think because it was a book and it kind of took off, it was in an odd way a slightly wider audience saw or read it. And I think for that, it kind of then becomes that very convenient point for people to kind of go, oh yeah, there it is. So in terms of that, you would say that that in terms of people pointing to something that they felt they were knowingly influenced by, you would say something like Anne Rice would be very important. I do think that things like Dark Shadows, and to be honest, even something like that can be seen to come from the monsters, just because you have Grandpa, and suddenly it's this a much more familiar figure, and even Count von Count in something such as Sesame Street. It's almost that they kind of prepare the ground for that popular imagination, then grab onto the thing. And so in some ways, I think you can almost point to Anne Rice as being the thing, but all the other ones are actually the ones that prepare everybody to think, okay, I have a space in my head where I can see this all works, and the figure where this works, and yes, Lestat or Louis, depending, is the one that really encapsulates that for me. So I think that I do think Dark Shadows has been forgotten a lot, particularly outside of the States. But most people will always point to something like Anne Rice as being the one. But there are just so many other, and everybody, as you say, would have their own one to think, yeah, this is the one that really changed things for other films and stuff.
Okay, thank you so much. We have a time for another one question. Anyone? No. Okay. Well, yeah.
If I can interrupt, I'm just trying to do 5 things at the same time, so sorry if I'm not reacting promptly. I don't have any questions, but Simon, let me just congratulate you on your wonderful speech, because that was right where my interests lie as well. So I was delighted to listen to you. That was brilliant.
Thank you. I should say, in case somebody was interested at all to see the list of all the films each year and what have you, I do have one of those, so do feel free to send me a mail or something, and I can send that out to folks.
Where can we contact you, Simon?
Just on my my normal email, which is baconetti@gmail.com. So that's bacon with ETTI put on the end at gmail.com, and I will happily send that out to anyone who is keen.
And you're at Baconetti with double T on Twitter.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. So Simon, thank you so much.
No, thank you.
Just could somebody put that? Could somebody put that in the comment section? Just email. That'd be great. Thanks.
Yes.
It's not, if you're okay with that, Simon.
Yeah. No. Do please do.
I'm sharing the Twitter handle right now.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, I would have done that myself, but I have no idea how on earth that works.
No. Okay,
we have
guys.
Enrica to do all the dirty job for us, so that's
excellent.
Right, thank you so much. So
may I say congratulations to Simon and good luck to Magda.
Thank you.
So, congratulations, Simon.
Thank you.
Right, over to Florin then, because he's chairing the next session. He looks very ready and elegant now.
Yeah. Sorry, can you hear me? Because I moved to the yeah.
And you're obviously sporting your James Bond's suit now, so yes, we can hear you, we can see you.
Ah, perfect, because I switched to the I switched to mobile phone. Okay, so now, but I was staying very calm because on the version of the internet it's written that the chair it's you and Enrique, but not a problem.
No, you have to refresh your website.
Yeah, I have to refresh. Okay, so in this case, should I present you? I think yes.
Yes, please, because I never remember who I am, what I do. So please do.
Okay, so just in order, because I'm sure that your presentation will be full of insights. I will not introduce you with this speaker's biography, and please let me allow me to give the floor to your presentation.
Ah, clever.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. All right. Thank you very much, Florin, for that. So let me just share my screen for a change.
Yep.
Without much ado. Hold on a minute, because I need to remember to do several operations before that. You just please tell, oh, sorry, this is not the thing yet. Could you, can you see it?
Yes, yes.
Right.
Okay, you can make it full screen now.
That's full screen. I can't see anyone, so if you need to interrupt me for some reason.
We are here. We are communicating from time to time that we
All
are
right.
here.
All right. Thank you very much. So I have the pleasure to begin the first panelist session with the title, as you can see on the screen. I'm going to talk about a Polish vampire film, which is a very rare thing. If you're not Polish, maybe you don't know this. If you are Polish or know anything about our culture, it's a rare thing. And horror is a very rare thing in Polish cinema as well. I need to ask someone who's not muted to mute their microphones, because I can hear a lot of noise. Thank you very much. Right, so first of all, if you look at my title, which is Patchwork Gothic, I thought about such a term while I was thinking about The Lullaby. This is the film that I was, the Polish film I'm talking about, and I devoted most of the year to researching this title. The film was made in 2010, so it's not very new, but it's 21st century. And as I say, this is a rare example of vampire film in Poland. And looking at it from various perspectives, you cannot call it anything different but a patchwork Gothic, a mix of all sorts of elements, like classic cinema, Hollywood cinema, from the very start, and Gothic elements are also very far from Slavonic culture. And when I thought about this name, I typed Patchwork Gothic into the search engine, and it obviously turned up that I'm not the first one to to think about such a term, which is a pity, by the way. But someone from Lancaster, I think, from university in Lancaster, used this very term, Patchwork Gothic, before me, in relation to Gothic fiction in general. So they are arguing that Gothic as a genre is already a patchwork of medieval and historical romance, with the novel of manners, supernatural, some crime stories, some sensational stories. So in this sense, it was presented. As also, they are referring to Horace Walpole, so the author of The Castle of Otranto, 1764, and probably the guy from whom everything, well, Gothic literature began. And this patchwork Gothic was used to in relation to Strawberry Hills. Which is his mansion near London, built in a very Gothic style, and which gives people a lot to think about, to many people. Right, so this is it. So I explained the title, and now I'm going to just point out that Miłosz Machulski's The Lullaby is also a comedy horror. And first of all, before I go any further and explain about Polish horror in general and the film later on, just let me stop for a moment on this phenomenon of comedy horror, which is quite a popular genre nowadays, but it's a very curious phenomenon when you think about it. So at the first glance, the connection between the genres of horror and comedy can be as perplexing as the relation between horror and humor. Nevertheless, following the reflection of Noel Carroll, although, and I'm going to quote, being horrified seems as though it should preclude amusement, there is some intimate relation of affinity between horror and humor. The above statement can be also supported by Francis Hadjion's incongruity theory, stating that an essential ingredient of comic amusement is the juxtaposition of incongruous or contradicting objects, so events, categories, propositions, maxims, characters, and so on. Then I can propose that the defining element of horror genre is the presence of fearful and loathsome monster for the sake of evoking laughter. The monster has to be deprived of his fearful properties, and in other words, horror can only turn into comedy or farce when the nature of terror is disturbed in such a way that results in an amusing effect. So hence this incongruity theory and making something that used to be horrifying funny. And so at some point the term comedy horror was dubbed in cinema, and it started very soon, to be honest, even in the pre-war pre-Second World War time. But after the Second World War, it's really clearly visible when the pre-war era from the start aimed at deconstructing the ethos of terror and dread. For instance, not to look very far, we can see these examples. So Abbott and Costello and their series of adventures where they meet all the classic Hollywood horror characters like Dracula, like the Wolfman, the Frankenstein, very often played by the same characters who were starring in the original films. So this is something, the phenomenon started and it stays with us till this day. So we have these laughter-evoking tricks aiming at familiarizing and ridiculing of the well-known and once fearsome characters, laughing at the cliches, simply. And just a moment, I'm going to stop at this slide for a moment. This is by no means this is all we have, but we don't have many more Polish horror films. So yeah, we started from early on, from some films that mention or propose some horror elements. So they are Charlotte's Mistress is not a horror as such, but we have some elements in it. Then we have probably one of the most famous films, which was made in the pre-war time in Yiddish. So Israel is taking care of prolonging its legacy, and it's Dibuk, and it's referring to some Jewish folklore, but it was filmed right behind the corner where I am here in Poland. And then in the 60s and 80s, such a thing like TV theater started. So we're talking about TV medium here. But every week we would have a theater being produced, performed live on TV, and some of these were filmed. For instance, The Vampire, which is based on Tolstoy stories, or Canterville Ghost, which most of you are probably familiar with, or Carmilla. So we have our Polish version of Carmilla. It's an hour-long TV production, black and white, with some very interesting, very well-known Polish actors of this time, with some 80s music. You wouldn't believe what they've done with it, but it is exciting. Sadly, I've never found a translation, English translation, so maybe I should do it to be able to show it to the world. But then the contemporary cinema is in the horror genre appears more often. We have films like you can see the titles. Just let me stop on two things. I Like Bats, which is a vampire story in 1985, and The Lullaby, the film I'm going to discuss in a moment. Now, okay, every one of you probably is aware of this film, for which unfortunately we probably cannot claim credit because it's an American production, but still it's Roman Polanski, so we have our Polish director here. Yeah, but apart from that, let's get back to Polish playgrounds, and we have our like bats. As you can see, this is very 80s. It was it's probably now it's mostly forgotten, but if you dig deep, you can see at least the trailer on YouTube. And as it is, as I said, is very 80s in proposed themes and stylistics as well. That was the time when at long last, eroticism could be discussed or shown on TV or in cinema. So yeah, the producers jumped into it, and we have this wonderful production. Wonderful production, which is I like bats. And now on to Lullaby. So Juliusz Machulski is a very well-known director. He's still making films, but he's mostly connected to comedies. So he's known for comedies, and he's been criticizing Polish society, Polish political system in this guise of comedies and farces for as long as we can remember, as long as he was around. And the Lullaby is not an example here. If you have a look at this slide I'm showing you now, you can right away see why I thought about patchwork, because obviously some of these characters can seem familiar to you. And let me just tell you a little bit about the plot. It's the story of the family of vampires who are 3 generations of vampires. There is a grandpa, there is his son and his wife and kids. So again, very post-millennial approach to the vampire theme. And they move into a small village by Mazurian village, which is a lake district in Poland, in search of jobs, in search of just stability and making something for themselves. And very soon, as you can imagine, people from the vicinity or the visitors start disappearing in mysterious circumstances. So something is afoot. And you can probably guess what's happening in the film. Let me just move on. There is another shot from the film itself. So it's not even the promotion still. It's a shot from the film. So talking about patchwork and various characters, let me start with the scenery, so you can right away see this reference, very strong reference to the classic themes, classic mise-en-scene costumes as well. At least at night, because they dress up in the traditional Western style at night, whereas during the day they are trying to blend in the society. They are day walkers, as is quite common in the 21st century. But you can see that this is as gothic as can be. This poster shows it, and then the makeup as well. So we have all full moons, night times, hooting owls, wolves howling in the distance, and so on. So this is definitely a gothic film, a classic gothic film, let's say, set in the very contemporary Polish setting, which, believe me, has nothing to do with Gothicism. So a Polish village is as far from Gothic imagination as you can imagine. One of the critics even commented that this film can only be viewed and is only valuable as much as it borrows, reinterprets, and recalls from Hollywood's horror tradition. So basically, it is a praise and not so much of a praise in one, because it definitely refers to classics, but at the same time, it is very Polish. And let's have a look at the characters. Right, just as we have in Twilight, let me mention this unmentionable title. But yeah, this is a very similar scenario in that case, that they are, as I said, living in a small village in the middle of it. They work. In fact, they look for work. They are trying to sell some crafts work, like little figures they can sell for Easter. So they are trying to assimilate to a normal, everyday rural country life in Poland. But at the same time, they have to eat. And yes, you guessed, they eat, and their food habits are very traditional. So they need blood, and that's why all the kidnaps of all the characters that appear one by one in the story. Well, how they come about it without being noticed for a long time is we need someone to mute their microphones again, please. So they kidnap the characters, the visitors. They don't kill them, so they are very humane in this way. But they keep them in a shed nearby, together with the cars and any belongings that they came with, and use the tube inserted to their veins to be able to drain them of their blood. And actually, they are feeding their victims for them to be able to produce food as long as possible. Apart from that, they have their pale faces. Again, I just couldn't stop myself from doing this, because if you look at the grandpa, he's very, even if it's not a direct copy, it's very close to Nosferatu. So again, a homage to the tradition. Then another shot of the grandpa during the daylight, as you can see. And now let's have a look at the son, Michał. Michał sporting his Bela Lugosi cape most of the time, and his famous stairs as well. So what is it if not quoting Todd Browning's movie? And if we move on to Bożena, who's the mother of the children, it's probably very hard to guess which one of the female characters from the films that we know and Simon discussed a moment ago she resembles. But what came to my mind was Eva from Only Lovers Left Alive by Jim Jarmusch, not because they resemble each other, but it's the proclivity and interest in art, and she sits down every night to play music and classical music, and makes the whole family to do the same. So this is quite interesting, and during the daylight she takes care of her family. You can see her performing some daily duties like cutting wood or making sure that the priest who's lying here doesn't escape because they need his blood and so on. So she's an everyday woman, contemporary woman, taking care of her family as well. And again, back to the nighttime, and the nighttime is the time when they gather to dance together, to play music together, to look as gothic as you can imagine together as well. So it's a little bit like a gathering of vampire motley crew from What We Do in the Shadows, if you look at this picture. Again, the quotation from many very popular Gothic films. And then the question of, before we go there, we have, of course, then another aspect is children in this film, and the motive of children, which also very often appears in vampire productions, and they are usually very creepy, and and we can accept easily that there are grown-ups being vampires, but when it comes to children, it's a different story, and there is something in psychology of our understanding of the world about it. But here you have your three kids who are growing up in a vampire family, and are vampires themselves as well. And even though they don't do anything creepy yet, apart from the normal thing, yeah, I think that they are capable of scaring us to death just by watching them. There is a question of one of the sons asks at some points, So some existential problems appear, and one of the kids asks if he really is the son of the devil, because one of the victims told him that he's a son of the devil. So he is very, very moved by it, and demands an explanation from his father about it. But okay, let's go on because I'm running out of time. And I wanted to go through possible interpretations of the whole film. Without going into details, it is a dark black comedy. It is a comedy horror, but at the same time, it's a criticism of Poland's politics. It's a criticism of Poland's social life. So Mahulski did it again. So under the disguise of a light film entertainment, he is aiming at various situations, and you can see it even in the choice of the victim. So again, among the victims, you can have a policeman, you have a priest, a social worker, some journalists, and there is one German person, a random German tourist who came to purchase land in the vicinity. And that's, if you know anything about Polish situation and history, it is very, very, very telling. So when they at the end of the film, they release all the victims, and there is this scene that this particular shot is about, and everyone is dancing. There is this motif of dance macabre. The whole village is dancing, all the victims are dancing, and the vampires are dancing to some very scary, creepy, weird music. Again, it can be treated as a metaphor of dancing to forget. This is a kind of they are trying to mesmerize the audience and make them forget about everything that's around, that everything that happens to them. If you remember various political interpretations of vampire films, and obviously vampire figure was very often treated as a metaphor of bad political situation. Siegfried Krakauer, he was writing about Nosferatu, a German expression. He compared Nosferatu to the situation at that time, so the raising of Hitlerism and all the atrocities that will happen later on during the war. So this is probably, we can go a similar route in trying to interpret this final dance macabre of the vampires in the Polish village as a way to avert the attention from everything that is happening on the political scene and on social scene, basically. The very final scene shows the whole family of vampires. They had to move because of the situation got very dangerous for them. Namely, people started looking for the victims, and they had to move, and they ended up in Warsaw in the presidential palace. So they arrived there saying, yeah, this will do. So they move into the presidential palace, and we can read this right away as a kind of a comment again, but also the question is asked, yeah, it's a nice house, but what are we going to do here? What are we going to live on? A very, very Polish question indeed. So Polish people are forever looking for work, for jobs. It's something that never changed, even with the change of the system. So here we have our vampires in the presidential palace, which is probably not good news for us, or maybe it is, I don't know. Anyway, so if you look at this at the film as a patchwork Gothic, this is definitely post-millennial film, and you have legacy of Hollywood genre, of classical Gothic genre, just brought to the Polish village, contemporary village. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Magda. And now I kindly ask the audience if they have questions. Oh, let me see if there are. If
Marius,
not,
Marius
I have one.
Ah.
Yes, because I'm prepared with this question for you. So, can you tell me? Can you tell us something about the reactions in the media? For example, are some critics more vocal just because a very important part of Polish society have very strong Catholic feelings? So. I'm curious about if there are some critics or some reactions, so we don't need vampires and so on, but it's
yes, this is an interesting question, and indeed I can answer that. That because it's Juliusz Machulski, who, as I said, is known mostly for his comedies, and he's always criticizing everything around in the society and politics here, and in a comical way as well. First of all, when it came out, it wasn't understood because it's as I say, it's a vampire film, and Polish people are not really used to it. And then some of the criticisms that came were quite negative. Not because it's a vampire theme, but they just didn't understand why and what's it all about, why they look so weird, why they are not nice and Polish and Slovenic creatures and and so on. So it was unnoticed mostly. And it's still treated as one of the worst film by Machulski, which is I cannot agree with this at all because it's a great film. It's especially when you understand that he refers to so much of legacy, of Gothic legacy.
Okay, thank you. Because also I have my version of your answer, because recently, 1 month ago, actually, I was in Poland, in Krakow, and at the Pontifical University of John Paul II. So yeah. University linked with a double subordination. One is subordinate to the Vatican, and some professor from there, you are from Transylvania, you're coming from Dracula, you are our student. If they will come, we want to visit the Dracula castle. So at least from my perspective, they seem very relaxed with this subject, that being aware is part of the pop culture and so on.
Definitely, yes. It's I think that nobody treated him seriously in the first place, so it was too comical to be treated seriously. Our government didn't notice.
Okay.
Marius, you wanted to ask something?
Yes. First of all, congratulations, Magda, and a short question about the connection between the Polish vampire films and Polish history. Do you see a connection, or how is this connection perceived?
You may can you? I don't know if I understand.
Yes, I mean in Romania, for instance, the vampire is connected with the medieval history of.
Oh yes, of course. Yeah, well,
Transylvania and of Wallachia, of course. And my question would be, what about Poland? Is there a connection between the vampire myth and Polish history, or?
It's rather the question of, not, I think in my head it's rather about the question of Polish folklore, maybe, because we don't have as spectacular history as you do with Vlad the Impaler and Dracula, but we do have vampires indeed in our folklore. It is part of Slovenic folklore as well, but I think that unless you're specializing in this subject, what comes to Polish person minds when they hear the word vampire is rather Dracula, is Vlad the Impaler. So we're going your way rather than focusing on Slavonic culture. I think cinema is to thank for it.
Actually, it's the universal way, because that Dracula is not our Dracula.
Yeah.
universal Dracula, yes.
I've been corrected so many times. But we don't
Well,
believe
yes.
you anyway.
It's our Dracula. It belongs to the whole world, that Dracula. It's not a Transylvanian invention, so we should be modest and say that it's a universal concept.
And that is true. Thank you, Marius.
Thank you so much and congratulations, Magda.
Thanks a lot. We're running out of time, so one more. Oh, Nina. Nina, a Polish person. Yes, I'm in trouble.
No, I just want to answer Marius, if it's possible, because he asked about vampires in Poland. So apart from the folklore, we have a really important myth about the vampires, which is in our romanticism literature wave. For example, the most important romantic writer, Adam Mickiewicz, thought that the Slavonian race has the monopoly for the vampires. It was his idea, and he was putting everywhere where he could the vampire figure. So it is also important, it is also rooted in our literature history, as well as we have this mythos of a patriotic vampire, which is also important and very curious, I think. And that's all, I'm sorry.
Indeed, yes, you can talk from many perspectives, but
thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. So now we are moving to the next presenter from this first section. So here it's Alexander Williams, and some words about Alexander. It's that he grew up in rural Norfolk, where he spent his childhood exploring old farmhouses and abandoned churches. He remembers nothing of his time in boarding school, as he spent all his time in the library with his nose in a book. He was homeless between the age of 17 and 25, and this kept busy during the day by volunteering at in an Oxfam bookstore by night, and he worked where he worked on his first novel, Eternal Youth. Sitting in one McDonald's with the notebook and the pen. He is now a grown man who shares a small cottage with a black and white cat named Wumbi, and stays up every night writing by candlelight. He's diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, and we have to add also that Eternal Youth won the Gold Stake Award for the best vampire novel at the International Vampire Film and Arts Festival in 2020. So, Alexander Williams, now the floor is yours. Let me.
You're muted. Sorry, before I just wanted to say one word, because I invited. Alexander is my guest. We had the pleasure to meet in June at the Vampire Film Festival in Wales. And obviously he's a wonderful writer. Let me just present the title. I don't know if you can see it. Yes, you can see it. So I have this book here. And a wonderful personality as well. So I'm really curious about your talk about the book. Alex won his prize, his Gold Stake Award in 2020, and that was during the pandemics. That's why he got back in 2022 and was holding his golden stakes throughout the whole festival, and we all enjoyed that very much because that was wonderful accent in the day in the festival as well. Alex, if you can unmute yourself because we can't hear you.
Sorry. Hello. I had to leave the pub I was in because they didn't have any plug sockets. So because it was an old pub.
All right, we can see you, we can hear you. So.
I'm in the library, which isn't very. I've no Wi-Fi set up at home yet, so it's a bit It's not very vampy. Is there a way for me to change my background, Magdalene?
Probably, yes. Let me see. When you have your camera,
Yeah.
there is
I've never
an
done this
option.
before. I've never done this before.
On the left, where I have it is on the left side at the bottom, and you have the camera icon, and you can open some options, and you have change.
That's brilliant.
Choose video, choose virtual background.
Does that
Done.
work?
Done. You've done it.
Oh, cool. It's cool. Okay. So yeah, I'm now figuring out age 30, you know, that I was homeless as part of Asperger's syndrome, like because it just doesn't allow you to function like a normal person, and it causes a lot of conflict with individuals. So like with the vampires and the obsessions and things, I'm very strong, but socially very weak. But at the time of being homeless, I was placed, I now know due to my Asperger's, I was placed in a women's shelter. And I was very in tune with what was going on with the women and how they came to be there. And I was reading a lot about the Cromwell Street murders, where Fred and Rose would collect women from a particular bus stop who they knew would always had a suitcase, always traveling to London. And none of the bodies that were found in Fred and Rose's house were ever reported missing, which I found really horrific. And nobody ever reported me missing. And I was sort of, I was in the emergency accommodation safe, but painfully aware that many people aren't, and that they don't get reported missing, they are lost, and each night that they're outside, not inside, they're at risk. And when I looked at a map of the area that Fred and Rose lived, you could see around their house a network of hostels, women's shelters, and it acted like a spider's web with them in the middle. And so I was researching this and decided to write a fiction where different women, it's told from the point of view of different women who, for one reason or another, become homeless and are the candidates for these two particular vampires who know by the scent of depression that these women won't be reported missing for any particular reason. Like they're very careful who they pick, and they steal their life and grow young for another couple of days before reverting back to old age. And it was sort of a book that sort of like having Asperger's, I find it very difficult to communicate with people and to speak about certain things. And also half the world is sort of tuned into the capitalist salary, job, house, mortgage. And it was just my way of saying what I feel I really wanted to say, that the world, the sort of small towns and cities are sort of the shop front, but behind the fronts and the buildings and the leases and the things that sort of the statuses and the jobs, there are people sort of moving through alleys and moving through shelters and always moving. And I was always moving, always in a cafe by day and then in a McDonald's by night, always moving. And it wasn't until I came to stop in the emergency accommodation, because I got very ill one winter, that I realized how exhausted I was from being constantly just on the move to stop any sort of predators catching up or anyone from ever even getting close to me. And even when I'd rent in places, I was always aware that other people were around and noises. And of course, I now know that that's autism. That's perfectly normal to be sort of creeped out by noise. but reading about the Cromwell Street murders, and that was so horrific that I couldn't, it was much worse than anything I could put into fiction. But I was reading a lot of Thomas Harris at the time and thought I'd really like to do something like that. And I wasn't working at the time. I was getting disability for the first time in my life. And I thought I'll spend this year writing a book and get it out of my system. And Rose and Charlie just came as if they'd always been there, really. They were like sort of a product of the music I liked. They're from the 1960s. And so their whole life is about sort of recapturing the 60s and the glamour and the sort of music, but they find that the modern world doesn't quite match up to that. And so they're sort of tragic as the victims in a way, because they're stuck in time and can't move on themselves. But I had no idea that it would be so well received. But I didn't have a computer when I was writing. I just had a typewriter because I was poor. And then once I got a computer after I got housed, I was able to put it up online, and just had a massive response from people who had all been through the same thing and had all been all over the world. It said, you know, one woman wrote to me saying that she gave birth in a hostel. And it's just, even now that I live normally with my partner, there's a part of me that preferred the hostel, because it was me sort of being honest about my situation. I didn't have to lie anymore. Like, I was working a lot while homeless, and was so aware that after work everybody went home, everybody got in their cars and went home, whereas I had to walk to the nearest cafe, and then I would write just to pass the time. It was all about sort of passing time, losing time, because life was unbearable. And I think things were simpler then, and I still find bills and things unbearable. And I now understand that Asperger's are more likely to be homeless because they can't handle pressure indoors. It's not, I think our emphasis on society on homelessness, like the women in the book, were one girl was a runaway, the other one, the relationship had broken down. But I now understand from living it that some people are never well enough to maintain a home all by themselves, and they opt for a homeless existence just to not have the pressure. And I didn't touch on that in the book, and really do want to with another one, like an autistic character. But because I was inside of it at the time, I wasn't able to look at my own situation from the outside and see what the cause was. At the time, I just thought I couldn't hold down a job, and I was just kind of useless. But now I understand that having Asperger's syndrome means that you're always going to struggle with those things, and you need to sort of, like, I had no idea disability even existed. I was brought up in a middle-class home with parents who were very interested in appearances. And in the book, one of the characters, her mother there's a lot of emphasis on appearance, and she's suffering eating disorder in silence because her mother just doesn't see it. And so I had no idea that disability was a thing, that there's help out there, that, you know, I couldn't communicate with anybody, and invalidating environments, and sort of, yeah, it's all in the book. It all went into the book. It was like, yeah, it was like my life, really. And I really miss it. It was having every day where the only thing to think about was the writing was really lovely. And now it's yeah, now I'm housed. It's like I find that I've got to sort of always be thinking about the bills or the next thing. There's not a lot of room for books. But the festival was wonderful, and it was wonderful to meet other people. And but the emphasis on youth and beauty was a lot of fun to play with. But I really wanted to do new vampires that hadn't been done before. I wanted to invent my own, because I was aware that in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, there was a different monster every week, and I thought I'd love to do books where there's a different monster, that there's sort of a link between mental health and other things, that I could talk about the real things using fictional monsters, and vampires are sort of infinite in their there's so much there to use. You can pick and choose. Is that okay, Magdalene?
Absolutely. Not sure if you're asking me about your speech or if you're asking me about the idea. Both.
I wanted to free. I didn't. I kept trying to write a particular speech, and it just didn't. It just didn't work. I'm much better in the moment.
Of course, I know that.
One thing.
Mhm.
One
Okay,
thing
go
I
on, sorry.
really, one thing I really enjoyed doing was the artwork, and the self-publishing gave me the option of doing my own covers and my own like I really wanted it to be like nicotine, and finding out that I was good at sort of this more creative stuff was really nice.
Brilliant. So thank you very much for that. It was, as always, very moving, very touching. Testimony to both your working process and what's happening in your life, and also, as always, the source of very interesting ideas about vampires. So my question is, if I can start, is there a plan to fulfill this this promise to yourself? So are you going to continue writing?
I have written another one which needs editing, but I think I think I stopped writing at the beginning of COVID, and I moved from my social housing in London to Eastern Europe to be with my partner, who you met. But I had some trouble adjusting to the environment there, and then got a bit lost with homophobia and other things, and I couldn't stop being worried about certain things. So now I'm back in England, but I'm hoping to go back over there, because I was able to write because he was supporting me and helping me sort of manage. I now understand that I don't manage very well alone due to autism. But
yes, okay, it's important to have someone to support you.
yeah.
I just getting back to your book, I've just posted a link in the chat to your Amazon website, so you can.
Yes. Have you read any of it, Magda?
I have, indeed. And you have some other people who want to talk to you as well. So thank you very much, because that was really really lovely, and I recommend it to everyone. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here, Alex. Well, the book really is as it said, Florence said in the introduction, it's a best-selling book, and it is quite recent. So get hold of it.
Could I talk about the next one? I wonder if I can do something clever here. One moment. Just give me a second. I really want to do this. This is really good. Hang on. So there is an illustrated edition, and an artist in Austria produced illustrations of it, which was amazing. And that's available direct to me if people really like the story and want something special. It's a hardback illustrated edition. I didn't know I could do this with the video screen, you see.
Oh, hold on a minute.
Otherwise,
I have to make you a co-host. Yes, you can do it now. You can show.
I want to just, yeah. So this is the, I don't know if people can see it. This is the next, the cover art for the next one, which is called the Spider Queen. And it is, yeah, it is, you can see, there we go. It is about so rather than it being two vampires, it's a network of social workers, doctors, police, who all make referrals back to a psychiatrist who's this very large spider who, in human form, who drains sort of happiness and joy out of people. And if you've imagined sort of an entire city where it's the doctor, it's the social worker, it's the policeman, and they all refer teenagers back to this one woman who is sort of at the center of the web. So whereas in the first book, same characters are in the next one, but whereas in the first book it was two vampires who were sort of like stalking kind of aging individuals, this one plays on the idea of a bad network, like a social, like almost like a bad social media, sort of like where when you look at the doctor's surgery, it looks like a normal office. And then when you look again, it's an enormous spider's hollow. But she's actually quite vampiric in how she drains people of all the color. And so with this one, I sort of looked at grays and sort of sucking the color out of everything, really.
It sounds very interesting, and it looks lovely.
Being autistic, I just wanted to say that I'm never sure if I should be in the mental health bracket at all. Wasted a lot of time going to GPs and looking for a solution to a cure, a disease that actually wasn't there at all. It's just that I look at the world differently. And it's amazing how many, like even Virginia Woolf was told that she should stop writing. It was bad for her illness. And I am always in two minds over whether or not I should pursue writing 100%, even if I go homeless, and be happy there, or not write to sort of, because it's only when I'm writing do I feel like I'm really like my English teacher rang me and said, it's when I read Eternal Youth, it was like I could see how you see the world. And I think it's a bridge to communicate with people. And I don't communicate very well. Often the moment someone is in front of me, Magdalene, you saw, it's almost like I go into I'm not myself at all. It's like I'm always trying to make someone laugh or impress them. And I'm always feeling inferior, a lot of social anxiety. And I think you saw in the festival, it's just a nightmare to be around such creative, talented, whole well minds and souls who could pay their rent with their talent. And then there was me. I'd written the book only because disability had come in to take that burden off me. Because when I was working, I was suicidal. And once I started writing, it was like, oh, I'm not mad or mentally ill, because I wouldn't be able to write a book. So like the way I do it is that I do a bullet point list of the entire story from start to end. And then I cross off as I go. And the descriptions and everything are the sort of feelings that are sort of overwhelming, but the structure is tight because it's, and I learned this from reading Thomas Harris novels over and over, is that his structure is, and Agatha Christie as well, the structure is really tight on these novels. They're like like houses built on a very strong foundation. And yet with each chapter, I could be very emotional. And the 24 hours in the day doesn't allow me to be emotional or honest in any way. And so the books act as a way for me to communicate with the world. And you know, I have no friends in real life at all, and yet online I have like 1,000 people who all email and say, when's the next one? And it's very strange living in two worlds. One in England, I'm unemployed and disabled, and I haunt the GP surgeries. And it's like, I mean, my GP, the Spider Queen, is very much based on my GP in London, who was just sick of seeing me. And I didn't know what was wrong with me because I kept losing jobs. And now I understand it's Asperger's syndrome. But the moment I gave up on work and started writing, it all went away. And but I love that vampires for me were always a way to communicate about other things. Like they're the sort of you can talk about alcoholism, you can talk about mental illness, you can talk about, as long as it's as long as it's a vampire, people are sort of interested, you know. Sorry, too much information.
Thank you. No, thank you very much. There are some questions, I believe. So people are commenting already.
How do I see the comment? Sorry.
Go to chat, but let's start the questions as well.
Alexander, I have a question over here.
Hello.
Thank you very much for your very emotional testimony. It was very touching and important for me to hear it. During your speech, something got in my mind. The way you talked about time, and time looks like a very key concept in your creative process. So I wanted to hear a little bit about your perspective of time and how it's inside your work and your way of perceiving everything.
when I'm writing, I lose time completely, and that's wonderful. Like I commit to losing time, and I let go of time. But when I'm paying rent or I'm paying bills, time becomes something unbearable in terms of this month's bill or this month's. That's also why I think I need to go homeless again to write, because I'm even looking at how much electricity I use in a single day to be home to write, and how much that. But yet in the books, time is something that's stolen from every character, and I think there's a lot of sympathy for the vampires, especially in the books, because they want to stay in the 1960s, and I very much feel like I'm in the wrong time myself, and I'm only happy when I'm outside of time, like the festival, or I'm writing, like when I'm aware of opening times, closing times. Like this morning I got to the pub to attend the conference and they weren't even open yet, and it's like I wish that there was no time at all. And I did make a commitment after finishing the first one to just write and forget about everything else. And then everyone sort of was really backing me up, especially like the readers and the booksellers. And then as money became an issue, because it took 2 years to write the first one and 1 year to edit, and so that's time again. And it's just a nightmare because you actually end up thinking yourself out of doing anything in the end. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it really answered. Thank you very much, Alexander.
Thank you very much. I can see that Peter wants to ask a question as well. Please go.
Yeah. Hi, Alex. Well, a lot of what you said resonated with me. I'm actually disabled myself. I'm visually impaired since birth. I don't know if I've always suspected I've had autism, and my parents told me they've suspected I had autism, but they never bothered to diagnose me. So
Mine too.
For a lot
took
of
me
reasons.
till the late diagnosis always comes with trauma, because people have been living an entire life the hard way with a lot of rejection and pain. And if you look at late diagnosis in adults, the earlier the diagnosis, they have a much better time because they're able to say this is what it is, and there are pathways.
But it's something I'm debating now if I want to get diagnosed, but that's not the. Okay, yeah, thanks. But no, I wanted to, I'm going to read your work.
It's a weight off. It's like people say autism isn't an excuse, but it's certainly an explanation for a lot of things that happen.
Yeah, but I was going to say.
Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, I'm going to read your book because it sounds fascinating. So, like, the talk I'm giving on Sunday is going to be about a disability interpretation of vampires.
Oh well.
I think I only realised it actually while listening to your talk, even though I was already going to give this talk on Sunday, but I think your talk helped me crystallize it properly in my own head for the first time.
It's very hard when you're alone.
I think I've been drawn to the vampire for ages because I somehow connected to disability and being an other, and I think I've only fully, after listening to your talk, grasped that.
Well, Interview with the Vampire, I was always obsessed with the fact that Claudia is trapped in the body of a child, and that this is something that follows her through the book that she cannot overcome. And also in the second one, The Vampire Lestat, I was obsessed with the idea that that there's a rule that Armand says to Lestat that they're not allowed to turn the handicapped. They're not allowed to turn them into vampires. That's forbidden. And of course, Nicholas is turned, who had no hands. And so I was always obsessed with Claudia as an image, because I've always felt trapped in sort of like, I think autistics, we have a high amount of intelligence, but yet we can't, it's like I'm a child at the same time, and you're always wanting to be held by the hand and led through life. Like I couldn't have attended the festival, Magdalene, without my partner bringing me there. Like he has to sort of take me and say, this is the place. And the moment I'm on my own, I just fall to pieces. And that's why always, when I was homeless, I reread Into the Vampire, because the idea that Claudia has to point to what she wants in a shop and Louis has to buy it for her, that I always wanted to overcome that. But each time I've tried, it's been a disaster. Like I moved into my own flat here and didn't have heating for months because I couldn't get the electric switched on. Couldn't, and I was walking all over town looking for an electrician and asking in shops. And then in a hospital, a police took me to A&E because someone called the police on me, which is so autistic. And the nurse said, "Have you heard of 24-hour electricians?" Which I hadn't at all. And so disability and vampirism is really fascinating. And if you look at Drusilla in Buffy, that she had, she suffered from intrusive dreams, which as a vampire became heightened. And this idea that the disability can give way to, I think Stephanie Meyer touched on it a little bit in Twilight, where there was one vampire which I really loved named Victoria. I know Twilight's a bit of a bad one, but she was an expert in hiding as a servant because she was beaten in the Victorian era. She was beaten as a servant, and as a vampire, she had this unique ability to find the safe spaces. And there was one line in the book where when she's running from the werewolves, she runs along the line separating the vampire's territory from the werewolves' territory. And Edward described it as her running along the line of a map that she instinctively could run. And my partner is an orienteer, so we often get lost in the woods together with a map and a compass, and we have to find certain points on the map. And that ability, as an autistic, being lost, in a world of buildings and alleys and opening times and closing times, that ability of being able to kind of I just found that mesmerizing as an idea, like the idea of disabilities being transformed in vampirism, that they can become something unique, whereas in life they sort of trap you.
Yeah, very true. I think you've also encouraged me to. I started writing a vampire novel 8 years ago. I abandoned it because my life just went down a completely different route. I just kind of abandoned writing, so I'm going to go back to that.
I've abandoned it at the moment, and I think until you can get things quieted down. But one thing I will say is that the moment you commit to sort of writing it down, even on a notebook, it's like, that is what I really think, and it becomes real. And I think getting it out of your head is the most important thing, because in your head it's jumbled up with bills and responsibilities and also how we see ourselves in terms of our age. Like, I'm now age 30, and at 25 it seemed perfectly okay to commit the rest of my life to writing books, and now age 30 it doesn't feel appropriate, even though I'm childless. I just feel that there's a maturity that needs to be acknowledged. And yet, Magdalene, I mean, but then I was always jealous of you, Magdalene, because you can justify the interest along with your academic job, whereas I'm doomed to be the autistic alone in his room. I want to write. And there's this attitude from people around me that Alex isn't conforming as he should and isn't going to work like he should. Even if those jobs always end in failure, and my partner is the only person to say, you really should write because people like it. And this librarian actually here a few weeks ago, I was in here and I was like, and I said, she said, I said, I'm unemployed right now. And she said, but I thought you wrote. And I said, oh, but that doesn't make any money. She said, but it will eventually. And I said, you sound just like my partner. And she went, well, he's right. Where is he? And I was like, I left him because his family didn't like that I wasn't working. And so I thought, I'll come to England and I'll work and prove to everyone. And it's been a total waste of time because I'm just back being rejected. And my partner is like, you really need to come back and write because you are happier. And that's also the paramedics who visited my house said to me, he said, I work 35 hours a week and I support 2 children, Alex. If you write, and you're good at it and your partner loves you, then that's what you should do. And I've wasted like 2 years trying to get myself set up to work. And actually it's, yeah, I mean, it's that thing of capitalism, money, you know. I think do you know there's autistics that wrote like Aragon, I think he was 15 and autistic, and his parents encouraged him. And if you don't have that confirmation from somewhere, you get lost in the mire of, I'm 30, I should be working.
Okay, thank you so much, Alex. I'm afraid that we need to finish.
Oh, did I go past my time? Sorry, I didn't realize.
Don't worry. It was all with the consent of the next speaker, so it's all right. But let me just point you to chat, because you have some people commenting on your speech and books, and people have already ordered your book online. So can you see where the chat is?
Yeah, thank you to Magdalene.
Communicate. Thank you so much,
Milo,
Alex,
for giving me the time.
Yeah, but thank you so much for turning up, because we didn't know if Alex is going to make it until the last moment. So I'm very happy that you did, and hopefully you stay with us for some of the conference at least. Thank you very much. And again, let me just show this book, because it's something to definitely look for. Thank you, Alex.